As we get into chapter 42 from Ecce Romani, we're going to be learning a very important and often used grammatical concept for the Latin language, which is called the subjunctive. We're going to have a couple videos for this chapter, and it's very important that you really understand these well before you move on. So take the time to watch, rewatch if you have to, and obviously ask questions in class if there's something that you're not understanding, because again, this is a concept that we're going to see again and again and again for the rest of Latin 2 as well as Latin 3 and Latin 4, this subjunctive. I would recommend that you have your book out and open to page 151 as well so you can follow along with the video. But let's get started. This chapter and several of the subsequent ones are going to talk about this grammatical concept called the subjunctive mood. And let's break down what both of those things mean. Subjunctive, sub, obviously means under, we know that, and junct comes from the Latin verb jungo, which means to join. So something that is subjunctive is literally joined underneath. And we're going to see the subjunctive very often in subordinate clauses in Latin. And those kind of go hand in hand. Obviously, a subordinate clause is kind of tacked on, or if you want to think of it, tacked underneath a main clause of a sentence. And a subjunctive verb, we're talking about verbs here, verbs are subjunctive. A subjunctive verb is going to be within this subordinate clause. What about mood? Well, mood comes from the Latin word modus, which literally means manner. And mood is another method we have of categorizing verbs. So we can categorize verbs according to their person, first, second, or third, their number, singular or plural, their tense, present, imperfect, future, perfect, pluperfect, future perfect, their voice, active or passive, and now their mood. And mood, all that is the manner of expressing a verbal action or a state of being. And for the time being, let's say that we have two moods in Latin. One is the indicative, and that's basically every verb that we've seen so far in our Latin books in freshman and sophomore Latin. Indicative comes from the Latin verb indicare, which means to show or point out. It's the mood of fact. If something is true, if that's the case, it's an indicative verb. This subjunctive, which we just saw means joined underneath, has to do with actions of verbs that are potential, tentative, hypothetical, ideal, or unreal. So a polar opposite, if you will, of indicative verbs, and that's what we have here. So we have indicative, and then this new mood, and we want to get in the habit of calling it a mood, the subjunctive mood, the mood of potentiality, of tentativeness. And we're not going to talk a whole lot about that in this chapter, but I do want to introduce it so it starts kind of floating around your brain to associate subjunctive verbs with potential actions. So let's look at a couple sentences here that feature subjunctive verbs and break them down a little bit to see how they work. So here's one. It's from chapter 42. Magister navis cum valde temeret suos vetuit nos adjuvara. The translation, the captain of the ship, since or because he was very frightened, forbade his own men to help us. So the verb in bold there, timeret, is a subjunctive verb, and you can see it's translated he was frightened. Think about the English translation, he was frightened, and take a guess what tense might that be out of tenses that we know, present, imperfect, future, perfect, pluperfect, future perfect. He was. Okay, that hopefully should ring a bell for you as an imperfect, and it is. Timeret is what we are going to call an imperfect subjunctive. So it's imperfect. Our English translation gives that away. We'll see why the form is imperfect in the next video. And if we look at this entire sentence this way and we put some of the words in red, those would be what we would identify as the main clause. And the words in black, since he was very frightened, well, that's going to be our subordinate clause. We just said a minute ago that subjunctive verbs, most of the time, are in a subordinate clause, so there we go. Subordinate clauses, you'll remember from your English classes, you can take those out and you still have a complete sentence, and that makes sense here. The captain of the ship forbade his own men to help us. That's fine, that's a complete sentence. But the subordinate clause, since he was very frightened, adds to it. And our subjunctive verb is in that subordinate clause. Let's look at another sentence. Cum quator dies navigavissemus, subito maxima tempestas cort est. Our translation, when we had sailed for 4 days, suddenly a very great storm arose. In this sentence, our subjunctive verb is navigavissemus, translated we had sailed. So think, what tense might that be? This should be very easy. It's going to be a pluperfect subjunctive because we're translating it with the English word had. And when have we really not translated the pluperfect verb with the word had in English? Pretty much all the time. So navigavissemus is what we're going to call a pluperfect subjunctive. And if we break this clause down, in red, that's our main clause. And then the black, that's our subordinate clause containing a subjunctive verb. And again, this should be pretty easy for you to break down into these two clauses if you've ever been awake in an English class at any point in your life. So let's recap. We've learned two subjunctives, imperfect, translated with was, in that first sentence, timeret, and pluperfect, translated had, in that second sentence, navigavissemus. We're going to revisit these two sentences in another video for this chapter and break them down a little more specifically as to why they're subjunctive and what kind of clauses we have, but that's coming later. For now, this is just a pretty general introduction, and let's be sure that we're okay with this before you go on to the next video, which will tell us how do we get these forms of imperfect and pluperfect subjunctives.